The catacombs beneath Paris have guarded secrets for centuries. Limestone quarries carved out by medieval miners, forgotten tunnels connecting neighborhoods, ossuary chambers holding the remains of millions. But few knew about the unmapped passages deeper still, the ones that predated the revolution, the ones locals whispered about in old taverns. Marie Devereux had inherited her family's curiosity about these depths, along with a leather journal her grandfather left behind, filled with hand-drawn sketches of tunnel intersections and cryptic notations in his fading handwriting. She had never planned to descend into the darkness. Then, in the autumn of 2024, a construction crew drilling beneath the Marais district triggered a partial collapse, and what emerged from the fractured stone was impossible to ignore. A sealed stone chamber, undisturbed for generations, and glimpses of parchment visible through the cracks. Marie knew she couldn't go alone. She called Thomas, her childhood friend, and an amateur historian who worked nights as a librarian, restless and hungry for something real. Together, they assembled a small team. Henri, an engineer with climbing expertise, and Lucy, a language specialist who had once worked translating medieval texts. They were not grave robbers or treasure hunters in the conventional sense. They were seekers of answers. What lay beneath Paris had been waiting for them to arrive. The journal, the collapse, the manuscripts, it all felt inevitable, as if history itself had orchestrated the moment they would finally know. The city above remained oblivious. Traffic moved through rain-slicked streets, tourists clustered under umbrellas near Notre Dame, Parisians hurried through their lives. But underground, in the cold silence of stone, something was about to surface that would rewrite what they thought they knew about the hidden histories of France. The real adventure had not yet begun. Chapter 1. The Journal and the Collapse. Marie stood in the construction site office, watching the foreman's hands shake as he pointed to the photograph. The collapse had happened at 3:47 in the afternoon. Without warning, a section of tunnel ceiling gave way, exposing a hollow space that no blueprint accounted for. The foreman had called the authorities, as protocol demanded, but Marie knew the bureaucracy. Inspections would take weeks. The chamber would be photographed, catalogued, filed away. By then, the university archaeologists would claim it, and amateur historians like her would be frozen out. She pulled the journal from her bag, the leather cracked from decades of handling. Her grandfather had been a cartographer, obsessed with the unmapped spaces of Paris. His notes were precise, almost architectural, measurements, angles, references to old property records and medieval guild documents. One page, dated 1967, depicted a tunnel system beneath the Marais that didn't match any official record. At the margin, he had written, "The room exists. I have found the entrance." But he never descended. She had never known why. Thomas arrived at the café near the Seine, where they always met, rain dripping from his coat. He had already pulled records from the library archives, medieval quarry maps, 19th century surveys, academic papers about catacombs. When she showed him the photograph of the collapse and then her grandfather's journal, his breath caught. "This matches," he said, pointing to the sketch. "The angles, the measurements, they align with a reference I found in a 1920s geology thesis. Someone knew about this chamber. Someone kept it secret." Marie felt the familiar pull, the sensation of standing at a threshold. Her rational mind offered 100 reasons not to descend into unmapped tunnels. Her instinct offered none. She called Henri and Lucy. Within 2 hours they were planning their first expedition. Henri insisted on safety protocols. Lucy wanted to photograph everything. Thomas kept reading, searching archives for any scrap of information about manuscripts, dead languages, anything that might exist beneath Paris. But no one found anything concrete. which meant, they reasoned, that whatever was in that chamber had remained truly hidden. That night, Marie lay awake, the journal open on her chest. Outside her window, Paris glowed with the amber light of street lamps, beautiful and eternal on the surface. Below, in the darkness, history was waiting. Chapter 2. The decision. The construction company had closed the collapse site pending investigation. That gave them a narrow window, perhaps 3 days before official teams arrived. Marie sat with Thomas, Henri and Lucy in Henri's apartment, spreading maps across the dining table like war correspondents planning an invasion. The engineer had spent the afternoon studying photographs of the collapse, calculating structural integrity, marking safe entry points. The collapse happened in the southern wall of an older passage, Henri explained, his finger tracing the stone face visible in the photos. But look here. The opening exposes the edge of a sealed doorway, deliberate sealing. Someone built that partition intentionally and faced it with stone meant to hide the joint. Medieval masonry? Lucy leaned closer, her background in historical documentation making her see patterns others might miss. Could be later, but the matching of stones suggests deliberate, skilled work, not accidental blockage. Thomas paced, energized. If someone sealed a room beneath Paris, they had reasons. Preservation of documents, protection from religious purges, political exile, religious persecution. The 13th through 17th centuries saw plenty of reasons to hide things underground. Marie said nothing for a long moment. She was thinking of her grandfather, of the notation on the journal's margin, "I have found the entrance." Had he actually seen this chamber before it was sealed again, or had he died still searching, the secret locked in his mind? "We go," she said finally, "but carefully. This is not robbery. This is discovery. We document everything. We leave nothing disturbed. If the manuscripts exist, they belong in archives, in universities, in places where they can be preserved and studied." Lucy nodded. Thomas nodded. Henri simply began making lists, equipment, protocols, contingencies. But that night, as Marie packed her climbing gear and flashlights, she felt something shift. The threshold she had sensed before now pulled her forward with unmistakable weight. Her grandfather's ghost, perhaps, or simply the momentum of history itself, a force that once stirred, demanded to be answered. Chapter 3. The First Descent. They entered the tunnels at dusk on November 8th, through an access point Henri had negotiated with a sympathetic engineer. The initial passages were familiar, the main catacombs, mapped and documented, tourist-marked with arrows and warnings. But they moved deeper, following Marie's grandfather's sketches through narrower corridors, where the limestone felt younger, less traveled. The air changed as they descended, warmer, thicker, carrying the mineral scent of undisturbed stone and something else. Something like old parchment or decay, so ancient it had become neutral, part of the geology itself. Their flashlights carved white circles through absolute darkness, the beams catching dust particles that floated like suspended time. Henri moved ahead, testing weight on certain stones, marking unstable areas with tape. Thomas carried the mapping equipment, a laser measurer, a compass, a digital recorder for documentation. Lucy photographed every marker, every scratch on the walls, every evidence of deliberate human passage, and Marie followed behind, the journal open in one hand, her grandfather's sketches confirmed with each turn, each descending passage. They found the first marker at a natural cavern junction, 3 rocks arranged in a precise triangle too deliberate to be geological accident. Thomas photographed it. Lucy noted coordinates, Henri marked it safe, and Marie recognized the pattern from her grandfather's notes, a symbol he had sketched repeatedly, sometimes with question marks beside it. An hour deeper, they found the second marker, scratches on the stone face, shallow gouges forming what might have been letters or directions. Lucy traced them with her fingers, felt the texture, studied them through her camera's macro lens. Not ancient, she said. Medieval, possibly, but the carvings are worn, weathered by time and moisture. Then, beyond a tight passage where the tunnel narrowed to almost claustrophobic dimensions, the ground opened into a larger chamber. Their lights swept across the walls and illuminated unmistakably the sealed doorway. It was smaller than they expected, perhaps 6 feet high, constructed with precise stonework that contrasted sharply with the surrounding natural limestone. The joints were nearly invisible. Whoever had sealed this entrance had wanted it to remain hidden, had possessed skill enough to make it nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding cave wall. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Marie heard her own voice saying, though they had agreed to no narrative, just documentation. The words felt right anyway, a gesture toward the audience that would someday know this story. But first, they had to open the door. Chapter 4. The Chamber Entrance. The sealed doorway resisted their initial approach. Henri inspected the mortar joints with tools designed for precision rather than force. They could not break their way through, not without risking structural collapse that might trap them or destroy whatever lay beyond. Instead, they needed to find if the seal had been designed to open, if a mechanism existed. It took 3 hours of careful work before Lucy found it, a stone slightly proud of its neighbors, positioned at chest height on the right side of the doorway. When pressed, it yielded slightly, a grinding sound of metal on stone echoing through the chamber. Something within the wall mechanism shifted. Medieval lock, Henry breathed, moving his light closer. Mechanical, not magical. Someone designed this to be opened by those who knew the sequence. Marie felt her heart accelerate. Her grandfather had known. Had he pressed this stone? Had he heard that grinding sound? They worked methodically, testing other stones in sequence, following what seemed like a logical pattern. Each depression triggered another shift in the wall mechanism. The door, they realized, wasn't meant to swing open violently. Instead, the entire stone facing began to separate from the surrounding wall, sliding inward on a track carved into the living rock. Dust descended in a gentle cloud. The beam of their flashlights caught something, a glimmer of light reflection off something metallic, or glass, or something that had caught the dust and reflected it back. As the door slid further, the opening widened. Air flowed out from the sealed chamber, carrying with it a smell that was not decay, but something like pressed flowers, like museums, like knowledge waiting to speak. "Manuscripts," Lucy whispered. "I can see them, stacked, preserved, real." Thomas gripped Marie's shoulder. "Your grandfather found this." Marie could only nod, her throat tight, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the doorway that was no longer dark, that was no longer secret. Chapter 5. The Archive. The chamber was smaller than they had imagined, perhaps 20 feet across, with a vaulted ceiling rising into shadow. But every available surface held evidence of deliberate human preservation. Wooden shelves, ancient and remarkably intact, lined 3 walls. Upon those shelves rested bound volumes, rolled manuscripts, sealed document cases constructed from leather and wood. The stone floor had been smoothed, leveled, treated to resist the dampness that plagued other underground spaces in Paris. And there was light, not from any artificial source, but from above. A shaft descended through the stone ceiling, so carefully carved that it created a natural ventilation system, drawing damp air upward while introducing minimal moisture. Someone, centuries ago, had engineered this space with profound knowledge of preservation. Lucy moved toward the nearest shelf, her hands trembling. "Don't touch," Henri cautioned. "Not yet. We photograph, We document, we report. The preservation is too delicate for amateur handling. They worked through the night, their flashlights steady, their movements precise. Thomas recorded measurements and coordinates. Lucy photographed every shelf, every binding, every visible marking. Henri checked the structural integrity of the stone, ensuring no risk of collapse. And Marie, unable to resist, found a journal, leather-bound, clearly medieval, and recognized within its first pages her grandfather's handwriting. "I have found the archive," he had written decades ago. "These manuscripts are in languages I cannot identify. Old Occitan, perhaps, or something older still, something that predates French, predates the Latin kingdoms. They must be catalogued, preserved, studied, but not by me, by someone with courage enough to face what they contain, by someone who understands that knowledge, once released, cannot be contained again." The implications flooded through Marie. Her grandfather had found this place. He had examined these documents, and he had deliberately chosen not to report them, not to claim them, but instead had left cryptic notes in his journal, waiting for someone else, for her, perhaps, to arrive and decide the chamber's fate. Chapter 6. The Collapse. The tremor was subtle at first, a low-frequency vibration they felt through their feet rather than heard. Henri's head snapped up. "Aftershock," he said, his voice tight. The original collapse destabilized the area. The weight distribution changed, and now a crack appeared in the ceiling vault, thin but visible, running from one side of the chamber to the other. Dust sifted down. One of the ancient shelves on the far wall groaned under stress, the wood warping slightly. "We need to move," Thomas said, stating the obvious, which was sometimes the most important thing to state. But as they turned toward the doorway, they heard something else, footsteps, voices echoing through the passages, other people descending into the tunnels. "Construction crews?" Lucy asked. "No," Henri said, listening. "These are different. Careful, quiet, deliberate. They're searching for something, and they know these tunnels well." Marie understood immediately. The collapse, recorded by the construction company, had been documented. Other explorers existed, other seekers, perhaps people who had been watching, waiting for exactly this kind of disturbance. The sealed chamber was no longer secret. It was contested ground. Another tremor. The ceiling crack widened slightly. One of the shelves tilted, only fractionally, but enough to send 3 bound volumes tumbling to the stone floor. They had minutes, perhaps, minutes to decide whether to photograph, to document, to preserve evidence, or to run, to escape, to ensure their own survival in the moments before the tunnel collapsed. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light," Lucy said, speaking into her camera, even as the ceiling trembled, even as voices echoed closer through the limestone darkness. The words felt inadequate against the weight of stone and history pressing down upon them. The footsteps grew louder, the ceiling groaned again. They had chosen. Now they had to survive the choice. Chapter 7. The Race. They ran, carrying what they could, photographs, digital records, one of the leather-bound volumes Marie's grandfather had annotated. Behind them, the voices grew closer, and behind those voices came the sound of the tunnel system itself, the ancient stone beginning its protest against the weight it carried. Henri navigated through instinct and memory, following the tunnel upward, choosing passages that would lead them to the surface. Thomas followed, then Lucy, then Marie, her hands clutching the journal, her lungs burning with exertion and fear. The passage narrowed, requiring them to squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for their shoulders. Behind them, one of the pursuers, a man with a headlamp, face obscured, was forcing his way through as well, determined, refusing to be left behind in the collapsing tunnel. Then the chamber itself gave way. They had just reached a junction point when the grinding sound of shifting stone echoed through the tunnels. The shelf arrangement, already compromised, finally surrendered to gravity and time. Dust rolled toward them like a living thing, visible in their flashlight beams, choking, inevitable. Henri pulled them into a side passage, a blind corridor that opened into an old quarrying chamber. They collapsed against the stone, gasping, listening. The dust settled slowly, and the sound of collapse became silence. Behind them, the passage they had just left was sealed with rubble. The pursuer was gone, either caught in the collapse or forced to flee through alternate routes. Either way, the archive was now literally inaccessible, buried once again, protected by stone and circumstance. "The manuscripts," Lucy said, still gasping. "They're gone, sealed in, buried again." "But we have this." Marie held up her grandfather's journal. "We have his documentation, his observations, his photographs integrated with ours. We have proof they existed." Thomas checked his digital equipment, intact despite the chaos. "And we have data, coordinates, measurements, photographic documentation. Enough to tell the story." But Marie understood something deeper as they climbed toward the surface. The true value of the archive was not in possession, but in discovery. In the knowledge that it existed, that history had placed it there for reasons. That human knowledge, once hidden, could still reach forward through time to touch those willing to descend into darkness searching for it. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The university assembled within a week. With Marie's documentation, Lucy's photographs and Thomas's data, they had constructed an undeniable case for the archive's existence. An official expedition, properly funded and authorized, began its own careful work to clear the collapsed passages and preserve what remained. What they found aligned perfectly with the refugees' work. The archive had survived, protected by its own stone barriers, and the manuscripts, when finally catalogued by actual scholars, revealed themselves to be exactly what Marie's grandfather had intuited. Occitan texts predating the 13th century, some written in languages that blended Occitan with older linguistic elements, representing a moment of cultural transition that had been nearly erased from historical record. One document in particular captured international attention. A letter, dated to approximately 1212, written in a mixed script that combined Latin, Occitan, and what linguists identified as Proto-Catalonian elements. It had been written by a scholar fleeing religious persecution, documenting knowledge about astronomical calculations and mathematical principles that would not be officially rediscovered in Europe for another century. The letter suggested that knowledge had been deliberately hidden, deliberately preserved, deliberately waiting for the right moment to emerge. The archive was not a time capsule, but an intentional message sent forward through centuries. Marie found herself at a symposium on medieval preservation, invited as a co-discoverer, standing beside actual historians and linguists who were now engaged in the serious work of translation and analysis. She spoke briefly about her grandfather's journey, about the journal that had guided them, about the collapse that had made discovery possible. But what moved her most was a private conversation with Dr. Isabelle Mercier, the lead linguist on the project. "Your grandfather understood something," Dr. Mercier said, showing Marie a photograph of one of the translated documents. "He knew that some knowledge needs to wait for the right generation to find it. He left it for you." Marie held the photograph, seeing the words that had survived centuries, seeing the intelligence that had persisted in stone and parchment, seeing the future that her grandfather had imagined when he decided not to claim the archive for himself, but to wait, to leave a journal, to trust that someone would arrive with both the courage and the wisdom to do what needed to be done. Chapter 9. The Legacy. A year after the discovery, the archive had been professionally excavated and stabilized. a permanent exhibition opened at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, featuring reproductions of the manuscripts and the story of their discovery. Scholars from across Europe arrived to study the texts, to understand what the medieval archive represented, not just a collection of documents, but a deliberate act of cultural resistance, knowledge preserved against the possibility of its destruction. Marie visited the exhibition opening, walking through halls where her grandfather's journal was displayed in a climate-controlled case, open to the page where he had written his famous notation, "I have found the entrance." Beside it hung a photograph of the sealed chamber before excavation, and beside that, a reproduction of the letter dated 1212, the words of a medieval scholar speaking across 8 centuries. She found herself standing before a photograph of the collapsed passage, the moment when the buried became revealed. Thomas stood beside her, no longer just her childhood friend, but a published researcher in his own right. Lucy had moved to the university to lead the conservation efforts, and Henri, having found his true calling in archaeological engineering, had been recruited to train others in the careful work of preservation. "Your grandfather would have loved this," Thomas said quietly. Marie nodded, thinking of that moment in the chamber when she had realized her grandfather had left the archive for her deliberately. He had descended into darkness, had found knowledge, had measured its value, and had decided that the true treasure was not possession, but discovery. The knowledge that truth, once hidden, can reach forward through time and touch those willing to search for it. Outside, Paris moved through its familiar rhythms, oblivious to the revelation occurring beneath its streets. But in archives and libraries across Europe, scholars were now engaged in the deeper work, translating, understanding, integrating knowledge that had been deliberately preserved, waiting for the right moment, the right generation, the right heart to arrive and say, "Yes, this matters. This will not be lost again." The adventure had changed her, not because she had found a treasure, but because she had learned that some treasures were never meant to be possessed, only honored, preserved, and passed forward to the next generation that would hold them in trust for all those yet to come. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.